to the cloud in case anybody misses it. All right. Welcome, students. Today's special speaker is Alice Salisbury, who I found on LinkedIn. This is what I call a proper marketer. You remember I show you my picture of the illustration of the path we take in my capstone class. And I always say we are proper marketers. We start at this spot, in the right spot, in diagnosis, at market orientation, moving to market research, crossing into strategy. Alice knows all this stuff. She is, I wrote that up. Has done it all. She's worked in creative agencies, brand consultancies, produces insights. She co-founded Inkling CC. Her and her partner deal with strategy, research, effectiveness, is a wizard on brands involving beverages, beer, whiskey. She's going to talk a little about that today. Like I say, I found her on LinkedIn. All of you should link in with her on LinkedIn, but I don't want to say any more. Let me turn it over. Alice, take it from here. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you. Fantastic introduction. Lots of energy. I'm going to aim to keep the energy levels up. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Just to say really quickly, sorry, the tech means I can't actually see you, which is a shame, but I'm hoping you'll be smiling and listening attentively through this. But any questions, pop them in the chat. And Professor Alma is going to share those questions with me. So do feel free to ask questions. And just to really reiterate, I'm really open to I find this side of things, the training side of things, incredibly important. So anybody who wants to connect with me on LinkedIn, please do. I know actually a couple of you have already done that, which is great. So do feel free to do that. Today, we're going to be talking about or focusing on the consumer and the consumer voice within marketing for exactly the reason that's just been outlined, is that in proper marketing, as it's called, proper marketing, in theory, everything should start with the consumer. That's basically the premise that my consultancy was founded on. So as already outlined, I'll give you a bit of my background in a moment, but I'm founder of a consultancy. We primarily work with kind of large international FMCGs. I personally specialize in the alcohol category, so in the beer and spirits category, with brands you will have heard, a lot of brands you will have heard of, but mainly working with kind of big, large consumer-facing organizations. And those organizations, the theory is that they are very much supposed to start with the consumer. Everything starts with the consumer. So a relatively simple topic today: how should we be using consumer insight to make better, more profitable decisions for the brands we work with? And as I say, in theory, pretty much every company these days is supposed to be consumer-centric. I have to confess, consumer-centric is a phrase I absolutely loathe. It makes me cringe just saying it, but mainly because the minute anybody uses it, I tend to get the kind of sensation that they don't really care about their consumer or their customer. So what we're really going to actually talk about today is why, in practice, most of the large corporations you will find yourselves working in the future are not consumer-centric at all. I'm going to give you a picture of the reality of what you're likely to actually encounter inside large brands and corporates when it comes to their attitude to consumer, versus the kind of the theory that is taught on courses like this. I love to hear that kind of absolutely classic planning process of starting with your market orientation, bringing in your consumer insight. But I do think it's really important that you understand as you go forward that the reality is quite different from the marketing literature and actually from the kind of marketing press and marketing discourse. But what we will also then look at towards the end of the session is some practical ways that you can close that gap between the theory and the practice. And I'm going to give you some examples from some kind of real life projects that we've worked on relatively recently, so that hopefully as you go forward into the industry in the future, you will be one of the people that gives the consumer a real voice within your organization and really does use consumer perspective to underpin your strategy. So to dive in, just to kind of say, quickly introduce myself. I'm founder of Inkling CC, or ICC. We're a strategy and research unit. We're based in London, but we do operate internationally. Actually, a very large number of our clients are over in the US. We work with, as I said, some of the kind of largest multinationals, but our approach is very much to use the consumer perspective to help clients set their strategy and to look for growth opportunities. I'm a founding partner there and the insight director. I started my career in analytics before moving into qual, so I very much started from the consumer perspective, but I do now do brand consultancy, and I've also worked in quite a lot of the big comms agencies as well. And as discussed, I do work across FMCG, but I primarily work, or my big focus is actually the alcohol category, because I do think the alcohol category is one where being close to your consumer is vital. It moves incredibly quickly. It's incredibly complex as a category. And the kind of the consumer dynamics and the demands are really, really high. And if you can make it in alcohol, you can kind of make it in any FMCG category. It's one of the most complicated ones you can work on, but therefore one of the most fun, I think. So I'm going to kick off by talking about the theory of, and just reminding us of why the consumer perspective is supposed to be important. I'm going to cover this relatively lightly, because I'm sure you have, as it sounds of things, actually had it drilled into you why the consumer matters, and you will have looked at the theory of this as part of your course. So I'm not going to spend ages on it. But I think it is useful to just set the context and remind ourselves of why this idea of listening to your consumer, it shouldn't just be fluff. It is an important part of growing and protecting your brand. That, it should be a vital part of the business. So I'm going to start with just some examples of the types of statements that you will have heard from brand leaders if you've ever picked up any kind of marketing press or business press, or frankly, one of those incredibly dry, boring autobiographies from CEOs and things. You will have seen some statements like this. And obviously, it wouldn't be a presentation about building brands without a quote from Steve Jobs. Got to throw one of those in there. So just Steve Jobs, I mean, I think the reason I put this one in, actually, I think is, interestingly, Apple is a company that tends to be thought of as very kind of founder-led, led by this very charismatic guy, and it was all about his vision. And he famously kind of didn't care what other people thought. But actually, if you really listen to what he says and the advice that he gives, it's all about understanding the customer. It's all about understanding the consumer. He was very, very led by that. So he talked about get closer than ever to your customer, so close that you can tell what they need before they realize it themselves. And that was really very much his founding philosophy, that it really was about understanding the reality of how people use these products, engage with them, what they really want. Only by really understanding that, only by really empathizing with it, are you going to be able to make brilliant, groundbreaking products. Another cliched example for a branding presentation, Jeff Bezos. Though actually, whatever you may think of his company, the reality is I think he is actually a very shrewd and sharp marketing brain. I think he does give some of the best advice out there. We're not competitor obsessed. We're customer obsessed. It's all about focusing on what your customer needs more of. Moving into FMCG, the point gets pushed even harder, which perhaps it's not a surprise. Clues in the name, fast-moving consumer goods, or I appreciate it's CPG over in the US, but still it's consumer is the focus. So the very kind of definition of the category is that it is about targeting and understanding the consumer. There's an entire category built off the idea that you're supposed to target your consumer. And the point here from this quote with John Moller is that, he's really hammering home, this is not just about comms. This is not just about, do we make ads that people like? The consumer perspective is supposed to underpin the very kind of mechanics of your company. It's driving strategy across everything. So superior products, packaging, communication, retail execution, and value. Every piece of your marketing strategy being driven by truly understanding your customer. And then, of course, there's the famous quote from John Carlson from SAS, talking about 50,000 moments of truth every day. And for those of you who don't know that, what he was referring to there was the number of times a customer gets on their plane. So the actual number of consumer interactions that they have. And I personally just always find this phrase moments of truth particularly interesting, not just because it's a nice phrase, but because it really emphasizes that, again, in theory, companies are supposed to treat other forms of business insight as subjective, while the consumer perspective is the objective one. It's the one that really matters. The customer view is the one that counts, because everything else is simply internal opinion. It's the consumer perspective that is the only true source of truth. Now, this rhetoric of treating the consumer view as almost your strategic North Star is everywhere. I guarantee you, if you read, I don't know, any Bloomberg interview with some newly appointed CEO or CMO, I guarantee you at some point they'll name check the consumer. They'll talk about how consumer obsessed they are. You're not allowed not to. You have to say you're consumer obsessed when you get interviewed. So I guarantee you'll see that in absolutely everything, and you'll hear it in courses like this. All of the big marketing thinkers will talk about that kind of consumer obsession. Apologies, kind of slightly busy slide, but I'll just try and talk this through to simplify it. But just to kind of really underpin again, it's not supposed to be spin. They're not saying they're consumer obsessed because they want to sound nice. They're saying they're consumer obsessed because that idea is the foundation of modern marketing. It's supposed to be not just part of the job, but the job. So think of this slide as kind of almost the story of how competitive advantage has changed as the nature of our economic systems have changed. So on the left-hand side, I'm hoping this shows up as left for you. It's left for me, the grey one. On the left-hand side, you have the kind of old product-forward logic. Advantage started in your factory, so with your company's access to raw materials and your production capabilities. And companies would make what they could make, knowing pretty comfortably that actually most other competitors couldn't make the same thing because you had the monopoly on, the supply of cotton or the supply of tobacco or whatever it was. You had those trade lines, and you had superior manufacturing that you had invested in and that was very hard to copy. You therefore just made what you could make, you aimed it at everyone, and then you pushed it out with promotion. And your profit came from supplying, essentially from volume, because everyone wants to eat, and they probably want to eat baked beans. There's only one brand of baked beans on the shelf, so everyone's going to buy that brand of baked beans as long as they know that it's there to ask for. So that was the kind of old model, and very much where marketing fits in there is just purely as promotion. Then we hit the era of mass industrialization, and that changed. So the means of production spread. Rivals could very quickly copy, and shelves filled up. And I mean, obviously now, once you get into the kind of digital age and digital retail, if you think about it, the digital shelf is effectively, it's endless. You have more choice than you could ever need. It's almost impossible to actually check out every possible option. We are, hate to mention it, but we've got to mention it. We're getting into the era of AI. That's potentially going to mean that for certain services or forms of entertainment, people are actually even able to make it for themselves. They don't even need you with your factory. They're going to produce it themselves. Maybe not the baked beans, but certainly some forms of entertainment or music or whatever it might be. So you can no longer assume that your product is the only one on offer, or that the only one people will want. In fact, maybe they don't even want baked beans. Maybe they want this new thing they've heard called spaghetti hoops instead. And you've got to convince people that your product or brand delivers something better, that it brings added value. And it's at this point that things start to shift to the right-hand side of that chart. And in most modern businesses, again, in theory, you don't start with your factory, you start with your target market. You learn their needs and desires, and you then create added value for them. And marketing is no longer just about communication, it's about the whole business organizing itself around meeting consumer demands. And that was a big shift that happened as mass industrialization came in. And that is really the foundation of modern marketing thinking, that it doesn't start with factory capabilities. It starts with understanding consumer demand and shaping your capabilities around it. With that in mind, as articulated by that previous John Moeller quote, within a well-run organization, consumer insight isn't just supposed to be something that's discussed when you're thinking about what you put in the ads. It's something that should show up in every part of the organization. Your organization should be built around it, operationally structured around the needs of your consumer. Everything from your growth strategy to your portfolio management, your product development, your brand positioning, and then, yes, fine, what you put in the ads. That is all supposed to be informed by the consumer perspective. And actually, when there are a few different surveys, I haven't put them all up here, but you can look at them. There's plenty of data to demonstrate that not only CMOs, but CEOs say they believe in the power of the consumer to add money to the bottom line. So they believe that it prevents wasted investment, that it improves or fast forwards innovation, that it helps you identify new revenue streams, that it gets products to market faster and more effectively. So if you speak to CMOs, they will tell you that. And I have those conversations with CEOs really frequently. They'll tell you that the consumer is everything for their strategy. So you would think, with that in mind, insight and consumer understanding should not be a hard sell into a business, and that ideas and strategies based on consumer insight would not be hard to push through a company, even at very senior levels. That's the theory. Let's talk about the practice, which I think it will now be fairly obvious, without wanting to sound too cynical, that I think is pretty different from the theory. I work with, say, a lot of the big FMCGs, P&G, Unilever, Diageo, Pernod Ricard, companies like that. And I say, without wanting to sound too cynical, I promise you that I think when you turn up in those types of organizations, you're going to be a little surprised by the reality, having been told how fundamental the consumer is to marketing and marketing practice. So we're going to start the same way. I'm going to give you some quotes, but these are not public quotes. These are quotes. You'll see I've anonymized them, and you'll see very quickly why I've anonymized them. These are quotes that we gathered as part of internal audits. So we often do an internal audit as part of our scoping work for projects. So when we're looking at kind of large strategic pieces, one of the things we'll do is we'll go and we'll interview people internally to understand different perspectives. And these are quotes taken directly from some of those internal audits. So what do brand and business leaders say when they're not talking to journalists, or they're not having their memoirs ghost written? So start with, the team couldn't pick an actual customer of ours out of a lineup. That was the managing director of a top 5 market for a global beverage brand, talking about the fact that he did not think that their marketing team, or in fact anybody in the organization, had any idea what their customers wanted, why they bought. I do not see why we have to change what we do based on what a bunch of people said. And the reason that I've included this one is actually that bunch of people phrase. One of the things that actually still kind of shocks me a little is hearing the way that some executives talk about their customers. There is a distinct lack of respect. Even little things like if you want to run a focus group, you'll quite frequently hear really quite senior people say, well, I don't understand why we have to pay them. Can't we just give them a free bottle of something? And well, no, these people are giving you their time. Their time is valuable. If you want their opinion, you have to pay for it. And that's reasonable to expect that. And they look at you like that's a really odd thing. There is a real assumption that they're the big brand and everybody should be really excited to be involved with them. Of course, that's not true. But also, the way that they will talk about their customers. I don't know why we're listening to this person. This is not the type of person I want as a customer. Okay, fine, but so don't take his money. It's that simple. There is a lot of disrespect around the way that people talk about their consumers. This was another one that was a little bit of a surprise. Honestly, we have no idea who's buying it. And the reason I've included this one, this was the marketing director. They asked us to come in and help them understand not why a product was doing really badly, but why a new piece of NPD was doing so well. They had launched something, and within 18 months, it was 20% of their volume sales. They had absolutely no idea why, and absolutely no idea who was buying it. And when we said to them, okay, but this should be really straightforward. Who did you think was going to buy it when you launched it? The chances are that's who's buying it. And they just stared at us blankly and said, we didn't think about that. So a product had gone all the way from ideation to actual kind of product development, R&D, like getting the liquid right, packaging design, comms, sell into the trade. They'd actually gone and sold this thing into the trade and gone as far as getting it on shelf. And now it was accounting for 20% of their sales. And at no point had anybody had a conversation about, who do we think might buy this and why? So think the idea that all of this thinking is being done really tidily, really sensibly, in a really analytical way in advance is, forgive my Irish, bullshit. Like, there are brands on shelf where it got out there and nobody even mentioned the consumer. This one was from is an online retailer that we work with. This, I think, if you work with any digital brands or online brands, something you will come across a lot. We have a ton of data and none of it tells us who our customers are. And I think this is a really big phenomenon we see within companies. And I'll come on to this a little bit later on, but there's so much data available nowadays. Like, you can have graphs for days. Like, you want a piece of data, we can get you a piece of data, anything. But what that does is create a false sense of security. So there is a lot of senior management who'll tell you that they have fantastic research and that they're really consumer centric. And when you say, why do you think that? They say, well, we have so much data. But then when you point out that absolutely none of that data is about their consumer, it's all about them, they're really surprised. And they find it really hard to mentally separate data that's about their brand from data that's about the consumer. So you'll see this in an awful lot of businesses nowadays, but particularly in any business that kind of works in the online retail space. They think they are consumer orientated, but actually what they really are is data orientated, numbers orientated. It's not the same thing. So why the disconnect? Why is there this gap between what companies and execs like to talk about and the reality within inside a business? And I think what I would say, as much as we like to talk about orientating the company around the consumer and embedding the consumer into our operations, there is a real challenge there, because actually a focus on the consumer is almost diametrically opposed to the way that modern business is structured and flow. So the same efficiency that allows organizations to scale also removes contact with the consumer. So just to give you some examples of that, some kind of practical examples of what I mean by that, just think about, it's really easy if you picture it as a company. Let's picture Starbucks. Picture it as a company going from a kind of small Seattle coffee shop chain to a global phenomenon. Picture that process and what happens in that process. So the first thing that happens is that face-to-face sales tend to be replaced by either online trade or if you're syndicated trade partners effectively. So purchases that were once in person are increasingly happening via third parties or other platforms, and that's going to strip away a lot of your consumer context. The next thing that happens is loss of proximity. So if you get into global expansion, but even regional and national expansion, suddenly brand teams, the people running the brand, they are physically miles away from the people that they're trying to sell to and trying to reach. So you're just much, much further away physically from them, let alone emotionally and mentally. You also get this shift in ratio, so a lower ratio of consumer-facing staff. So if you think about it, as a company gets bigger, particularly if you go global, you suddenly have a much bigger regulatory and technological burden, and you have to bring in people to deal with that. Suddenly, you don't just have one person in HR, you have 50 people in HR. So the ratio of consumer-facing to non-consumer-facing people within a kind of larger corporate shifts. And whereas previously you might have had, you'd be sitting in a meeting and at least 50% of people in that meeting would be people who had literally that week spoken to a consumer. Suddenly you'll be in a meeting and it's quite likely there'll be nobody in that who's spoken to a consumer at all. There'll be loads of people in the meeting, but none of them will be people who can represent the consumer point of view. You also have, I think, really, when you get into that kind of global level as well, so when we're talking about those kind of, really large, big corporates that we tend to work with, you do have a different management skill set. So your CEO is no longer appointed because they know the business and they know the category. They're appointed because they're part of a kind of corporate management class that understands operations, that understands how to talk to the financial markets, how to say the right things to hedge funds, which I don't want to disparage. That is an important skill, but it's a different skill. And they tend to be promoted across functions rather than up through the business. So suddenly you've got people leading the company who don't have that category context and don't have that consumer context and have never had it. And that just changes the culture of the organization. Which brings me on to, though, I put it on a separate chart because I do actually think it is just the biggest issue with bringing the consumer into the conversation and into your strategy, which is culture. Because consumers are messy. They're really messy. And I mean, I still do actually. I make a point of running focus groups on every project that we work on or attending them, because for me, I think it's such a good sort of sense check, or so it keeps you grounded if you just go and listen to real people talk. And it reminds you every time you do that decision making in the real world is not neat and it's not tidy. Consumers are unpredictable, they're inconsistent, they're very hard to quantify. And those are qualities that sit extremely awkwardly with modern corporate culture, which is all about systemization, quantification, repeatable models, things like we need repeatable models. That's something you hear all the time at the moment. It's a really big buzz phrase within kind of corporate situations. And consumers don't really conform to nice repeatable models. Now, I know you will have learned lots of nice repeatable models on your course. There's different, let's just take the purchase funnel, for example, ADA as the obvious one. And don't get me wrong, there are lots of people who are very anti using a funnel. I'm not. I think it's a really good framework for, first of all, diagnosis, but also for actually plotting out your strategy and making sure that you've not left any gaps. So I think as an internal tool, things like funnels are really valuable. Where those kind of tools become a problem is when we start to kid ourselves that they are some kind of real, genuine reflection of the mental process that consumers go through. That's not what they are. What they are is useful tools for codifying what we need to do as marketers. We can debate this at the end if you feel like it, but this is my view. They are useful tools for thinking about how we need to do things. They are not in any way a reflection of what people actually do when they walk into a shop and go and buy a product. So awareness, interest, desire, action. Great, sounds fantastic. But we all know that the reality is somebody kind of going, sorry, remind me who you are again. Are you the one with the goldfish in the ad? Because I like that. The goldfish. Oh, no, you're not. Okay. Oh, all right. I'm a bit bored there. Sorry. Oh, no, I was going to buy you, but then I had to choose between washing powder and pizza. And the pizza looked nice. I bought the pizza. Yeah. Sorry, who again? That's much more how consumers think and behave. The trouble is, if you turn around and say that to a COO or a CFO, they are much less likely to feel that you've given them an insight and much more likely to see that as a reason to panic. What do you mean they don't follow a linear process? Because we're allocating our budget according to that linear process. And now you're telling me there is no linear process. So it is much easier to tidy consumers away into data sets, to tell ourselves that we've got all these figures and that means we're doing evidence-based marketing, and never actually have to deal with the kind of messy reality of how people behave and how people really make choices. So consumers are messy, and corporate culture, modern corporate culture, is not designed to handle mess well. And I think that is the big reason that a lot of the time, senior management in particular, do not actually want to hear from their consumer. So I was just thinking about how to kind of sum this up, and particularly to kind of sum it up in a way that I hope will help us think about how to change things and how to do things differently. And so I'm going to get a little bit conceptual, but try and follow me if you can. Try and think of organizations in shape terms. So small companies, I tend to think of as spiky with holes through. So actually like the little right-hand shape there. They have lots of little spines and protrusions, whether that's help centers or stores that they still own and things like that, that reach out into the world and put them in contact with their consumer. Whether that's, the owner is still on the shop floor, or even if they're a little bit bigger, you find the MD still visits individual sales accounts. And that means there are still kind of all sorts of wormholes into the organization that a complaint or an idea can go directly through and kind of reach the boss really quickly. Just to give you a kind of real world example, my son has a form of epilepsy that means he kind of can fall to the ground very quickly. We were looking, he's also 15 and therefore a complete pain in the ass and really fussy about what he wears. And he has to wear some kind of protective hat. We were looking for something and we couldn't find anything medical that he was willing to wear. And then I found this site. They make protective headgear for rugby, a bit very English, a bit like American football, but basically like American football, but with bigger people, basically. We found this site where they made protective headgear for rugby games. And it's sort of like a headband that looks like a sporting headband, but provides kind of protection against concussion. And we got it, and he was like, that I will wear. And now he wears that. And I thought it's really interesting. I wonder if they've ever thought about, putting it out there for people with epilepsy. So I looked up who ran it, and I messaged the founder on LinkedIn and told her about it. And within a couple of days, she messaged back going, "This is a great suggestion. Thank you. I'd really like, actually, it's really interesting. I'm going to contact Epilepsy Action, this charity, and see if they want to, Now they're a reasonable sized company. They're not a small company, but they are not a big global corporate. And I can just reach out to them on LinkedIn and put an idea in them, and the boss can come back to me. So you can push these ideas through these kind of corporates, through these companies in a way you can't with big corporations. Big corporations, on the other hand, are effectively, they're engineered to be spherical, large, heavy cores, coming back to that point about kind of a lot of people who aren't consumer facing, people who work in HR, people who work in tech. So heavy cores, smooth surface. The surface area, the places where the company actually touches real people, has to have contact with real customers. It shrinks, it gets standardized. And decisions are made deep in the center, far, far away from where consumer contact happens. So if there is going to be any customer insight or consumer insight, it has to be channeled through layers, filtered through all of these internal systems, filtered through external agencies like ours. They employ, rather than going speaking to customers themselves, it's much quicker and faster to employ people like me to go and do that for them. So we then can speak. So not even speaking to them themselves, even when they do want consumer input. So by the time the consumer view reaches the core, if it gets there at all, it's been averaged out, it's been smoothed out, and frankly, usually it's quite late as well. So from a structural perspective, and this sounds like I'm kind of really digging at corporates, and I don't mean to. What I do want to emphasize is that actually from a structural perspective, it is really hard to put the consumer into your decision making. This is not me saying, aren't they all bad and terrible? It's not that at all. What I'm trying to hammer home is that actually, if you want to run an efficient company and you want to scale and you want to be a big global brand, it is really, really hard to put the consumer into your decision making. It sounds great in theory. It's very difficult to do without ruining that efficiency. So what I would say, I've called this ways to reconnect, but actually I perhaps should have called it de-sphering. I think when companies reach a kind of certain size, their surface area or their contact with the customer, it has to be artificially engineered. You have to find ways to kind of bolt on spines and protrusions outwards to keep you in contact with the consumer. You have to create artificial wormholes into the company to channel the consumer perspective into the core. And as I say, it's deliberately de-sphering. And I would argue that as you go out, if you choose to take on a career in marketing, part of your job is to do that, is to find ways to push the consumer view back into the organization, to try it. And it's hard to push against that kind of gravitational weight that is making these big companies increasingly spherical. How do you stop that? How do you help these companies still stay in touch with their consumer? There's kind of three big ways I think you can do this. If anybody wants to reach out to me about either of the other two to discuss at any point, I've got a kind of couple of books. I've done sort of sessions on this with different people on different topics, and I can really happily send you some stuff on the first two. But actually, the one I'm going to focus on today is the third one, because it's the fun one, and so I'm going to talk about that. But just to kind of give you a bit of an overview, three ways that you can really help a big corporation to desphere. Number one, balancing sources, and this comes back to what I said previously about there's so many companies that think they're consumer centric because they have a lot of data. In most cases, that data is about the brand in your business, or if you're very lucky, the brand in the consumer's hand. It is very, very rarely insight into the brand in the consumer's head, and it is almost never insight into the consumer away from your brand. And so actually one of the first things we tend to do when we work with a company is do an audit of their data and their data sources. And what we're normally able to demonstrate to a company very quickly is that basically all of the insight they've got is actually about their business and nothing to do with their consumer. So, trying to push back on that, trying to make sure that you are getting those consumer sources in there. But again, it's hard. Internal data tends to fit the system better. It's in language everybody understands. It's cheaper, frankly, because you can gather it yourself. So it can be hard, but trying to make a shift from data that's all about us to data that's all about them. Second thing is to think about timing. Far too often, one of the things that we see is when brands are talking to consumers, it's only after all the work has been done and when it's too late to affect a direction or a decision. So it's not, as described at the beginning, you do your market orientation, then you get your consumer insight. That is often not the way it works. The way it normally works is we make a decision, we decide we look at our competitors, we panic, we decide we're going to launch something because our competitors launch it, we put it out on shelf, and then we get everything ready and we're ready to go. And then we think we better put it in front of some consumers and see what they think. And they show it to them and everybody hates it. And then we don't know what to do because we've spent a load of money and we've sold this in across the organization. Maybe we've even told our shareholders that this is coming. Backing out of that because your consumers are looking at it going, I hate it, is really hard. It's too much time, too much money has been invested to turn back. So insight is only really valuable and helpful used at the beginning of the process. Insight as validation, terrible idea, because 99% of the times they won't validate what you want them to do and what you want to do anyway. Insight is inspiration. That's where it adds real value. That is a very, very big shift that a lot of companies struggle to make, but it's really important. So thinking about the timing is important. But the one I actually really want to focus on today is, sounds incredibly simple and flippant, but it's so important, which is making it entertaining. Most presentations that you will come across featuring the consumer within large organizations are incredibly boring. I sound so negative. I cannot stress enough how dull they are. 90-page PowerPoint charts that are just number point after number point after number point. So dull, data overload, really bland observations that you find yourself looking at thinking, we spent all this money and you appear to be telling me that people think quality is important. Okay. Really generic dashboards that tell you nothing about your specific brand situation. And so what I want to talk about today is trying to move that insight mindset from we are the data department to the way that we like to think about it at ICC is we are the ad agency for the consumer. So how do we communicate the consumer point of view in a way that is relevant, exciting, and engaging for people so they want to listen to it? This, I'm sorry, I've shrunk it down so you can't see who it's from, and I'm not going to tell you which agency it's from, but often with our larger strategic projects, we kind of get sent pre-work that's been done by research agencies. And this is just one section. This was a 120-page document that was sent through as consumer insight. And you can just see looking at it, dense text, graph after graph after graph, no real conclusions. So what we find is that too often the way we're bringing the voice of the consumer in, instead of exciting people, it causes everyone to kind of brace for impact. And instead of being an inspiring experience, it's a negative experience. Now, some of that, as discussed a minute ago, is partly to do with the timing. It's arriving late and as a verdict, not as an input, and nobody likes that. But say the bigger problem is the method of delivery. It should be the most human part of the process, but it is often it's the most bloodless and dry. So if we want the consumer perspective to shape the business, we have to make the business want to see things from the consumer perspective and start applying some of those principles of communication that we apply externally, internally. Just we'll check in my timing. I think I'm doing all right. So one that follows are some examples for one of our clients, Pernod Ricard. So European drinks company, but with a lot of brands over there. So you'll come across Chivas, The Glenlivet, brands like that. They also have a lot of innovation focused on the US as well. Now, what you can see on screen, I say I can't give you the full thing because it's proprietary, but this is their segmentation tool, and you will come across something like this in pretty much every large corporation. So it's a kind of classic grid dividing up occasions or drinking moments, in their case, into kind of key nights. So, for example, date night, for example, and then mapping audiences and needs against those occasions with quantitative data. And you will find that every FMCG has some version of this. The challenge that we were set by Pernod is that absolutely nobody was really using it. They were kind of coming up with ideas and then kind of checkboxing, going, yeah, this fits in beer with the boys. Why? Because we've got to put it somewhere. So no one was using it to make decisions. No, it wasn't driving insight in any real way. It became a tick box. And we were tasked with finding a more human and interactive way to get teams to engage with the data and engage with the insight. So how do we raise engagement by appealing to emotion? How do we disrupt embedded ways of working by making it more interactive? And how do we connect some of the insights in there with more familiar ideas to create greater resonance? So we use both their underlying data, the kind of quantitative data, as well as a lot of kind of qualitative and ethnographic work to create a category map that was literally a map. So what we looked at was how we divide the spirits landscape up, and then how we map different occasions and different needs against it. But what we created was an interactive world, effectively, that they could move around, tour, place their brands in, and actually physically look at things from different perspectives and different viewpoints. So just to look at the Whiskey Mountains up there, for example. So the Whiskey Mountains, actually, this came directly from something a consumer said. So we were talking to them about why whiskey is perhaps struggling a little bit as a category, and they said, look, I love it, and I like, I like feeling like I'm a bit above everybody else when I drink whiskey, but there's a lot else going on, and increasingly it doesn't feel worth the climb, which we just thought was a really interesting phrase. And we use that to kind of actually inspire this way of thinking about things. So you have the Whiskey Mountains, this kind of varied landscape where each peak represents a different aspect of the whiskey category. I'll show you that in a minute, but again, as a consumer would see it. You also have the more accessible foothills, but all casting a kind of a shadow over the whole category. We have luxury peak as well. And that's the bottles that most drinkers, they know they'll never reach, but they still enjoy looking up at it and feeling that they're in sight of it. And those willing to actually really spend time in it, they can drop down into the hidden valley and look at the rare finds and the kind of local barrels. We broke that out. I haven't got time to go into it in detail here, but we kind of broke that out. Say it was interactive. You can see there, you could kind of click on individual different peaks to understand the different categories, again, from a consumer perspective, what kind of occasions that meant, what features that meant in terms of products, the challenges, who the competitors were. You kind of navigate through it. So it's really important to understand that this wasn't just about pretty pictures. This was all very heavily data backed and allowed them to get into the data, but allowed them to navigate that data in a way that was fun, engaging, and most importantly, human. Similarly, we had Gin City. So totally different way of approaching things. Gin City, it's this vibrant cosmopolitan place, pulsing with life and color. It's a city of experimentation, of discovery, very, very different from the mountains. It's vibe-led. It's not about functional needs or, unlike whiskey, knowledge levels, but rather kind of feeling your way through the options. So you might start or be enticed in through a kind of carnival of fruity flavors before seeking rejuvenation in the botanical gardens, before moving on to the alchemist's theatre for those people who kind of really get into mixing and that side of things. So a completely different vibe. So it was also about trying to make sure within this very large corporation, portfolio management, you find all your brands crashing into each other. So actually, how do you make sure that your brands don't, you and your categories don't crash into each other? Giving those categories a different personality and a different feel really helped them understand. This work was absolutely underpinned by classic research approaches and the data from their segmentation, but presenting it in a way that inspired and engaged. And off the back of this, there was huge number of innovation streams that were kicked off. There was a big portfolio review. You're actually seeing some of it coming out now. Pernod have just made some announcements on how they're changing things, but the portfolio review looking at which brands to prioritize and which ones to scale back according to consumer needs. So they suddenly started really using it to drive their strategy. Really conscious of time, so I'm going to do a really quick one though, but just because this one was actually really fun. Actually, I love doing this, not least because we got to go and speak to loads of billionaires and millionaires, which was just quite funny listening to some of them talk. But another project we did for them, looking at their prestige category. And the reason I'm flagging this one is a lot of insight delivery is about simplifying, telling a story that the whole organization can kind of easily follow and then narrate to others. The challenge is that often when people try to simplify what the consumer is doing, they end up removing all the nuance and stripping out the detail and getting back again to those very generic perspectives. So how do you simplify without losing the nuance? And I would argue that simplification, it's not about stripping detail out. It's about finding ways to help people navigate the information more fluidly, more intuitively. So the reason I'm giving this example is the prestige whiskey category is immensely complex. There's loads of very big brands, there's tiny brands, it's sold through auction, it's sold through retailers. It's a very, very complicated category. And we were asked, how can we segment it up in a way that's more actionable? They were currently segmenting it by price, just looking at price tier. The challenge they were finding there is, just to take the $1,000 to $2,500 kind of segment, there are over 500 individual brand lines just in that segment. So knowing that your bottle sits in that price segment tells you absolutely nothing about what you're supposed to do or how you're supposed to behave beyond this is how much you should cost. So they were saying to us, like, how do we segment this category up in a way that helps direct action, given it's so complicated? And we looked at a lot of different options, but again, led by consumers. We went and interviewed all these millionaires who spend an absolute fortune on whiskey bottles. Many of them had kind of $50,000 bottles of whiskey just sitting on their shelf at home. A lot of them were kind of buying for investment and things like that. But what was really notable, they all talked about the same thing. We don't buy individual bottles. What we're trying to do is put together a really good collection. So they would even have spaces on that shelf, and you'd say, well, what went in there? And they say, oh no, nothing's gone in there. That's the space that I'm holding for the bottle that really does X. So they're thinking of it as a collection, because once you're talking about people at that level, they're collectors. So they're looking at the overarching collection. So what we built for them, I'm afraid I can't show you the final thing because it was proprietary, but I'd show you the sort of mock-ups that we did. We built for them a physical cabinet with each shelf in the cabinet representing a different segment of the market. Again, not pretty pictures, data-backed, consumer insight-backed. But it was really tactile. The CEO, and it was the CEO, could literally go in and go, well, hang on, where do I want Chivas to sit? Where do I want Royal Salute to sit? We did an exercise of putting all their brands on the different shelves and understanding where they sit and kind of going, hang on, all of our brands are in the same space. That's not ideal. So, we broke it up into, there was the number one bottle versus the bottle that they drink with the guys versus their regular treat versus the business bottle. we looked at the different layers and different kind of dynamics within each of them. As I say, we mapped the portfolio. So I think one of the biggest things for them was they suddenly realized that all of their bottles were sitting in one particular space, which is what we call the kind of dusty gem space, which made absolutely no sense because they're all competing with each other. So we were able to, for example, pull the Glenlivet out and say, look, there's a different space for you, which is about the statement piece. So a lot of these collectors, they have the piece where it's just this incredible almost piece of artwork, and it's all about the bottle design. That's where the Glenlivet should be playing. And actually, if you look up some of the press for the moment on the Glenlivet as being sold at Christie's at the moment, they've got a one-off bottle that's just this beautiful thing that came out of this piece of research. And for each one, as I say, just to really stress again, it's not pretty pictures. Every single one of those segmentations came with a really detailed briefing pack and breakdown of the numbers, talking about, well, what are the drivers? Within that particular segment, why do people buy? How do they buy? What are the behaviors around it? Where are they buying from? Which occasions are they purchasing for? And therefore, what does that mean your product needs to deliver? What's your spend threshold in that kind of space? So really, frankly, dry, businessy type stuff, but presented in a much more tactical way that made it able to kind of communicate a richer picture of the drivers that come into play at different times and different places, and for them to start really designing their strategy and their portfolio around real consumer behavior. So as I said, it's hard, and I don't want to say that it isn't hard, but honestly, the biggest thing that you can do to make the consumer cut through in an organization when you get out into the big world is to make it fun. It's a little bit like advertising in that sense. If it's fun and engaging, people will listen. If it's dry and boring, they won't. Which is where I'm going to finish, hoping that I haven't kept this too dry and boring for you, and that I've managed to be at least a little bit engaging. That was kind of pretty quick, so I rattled through, but do we have any questions from anyone?
That was, first of all, fantastic. I absolutely love that presentation. It certainly folds into some of the stuff we're talking about in class as we move into brand strategy, brand elements, distinctive brand asset, all that stuff, category, entry points, all that stuff. And this shows a really cool segmentation and how to use it. Are there any questions, students? Here's your chance. Put it in the chat box if you got questions. I know that you have to absorb all this stuff, but go ahead. Anybody have anything in the chat box? Or else take yourself off mute and shout it out. Here's your chance. Here's your chance. Come on.
Go on, someone.
I have a question.
Okay.
Fantastic.
Am I able to just say it out loud?
Yeah, say it, Casey. Yep.
Okay, so basically, thank you for your presentation. It was really great. But we just read a book in this class about, and it was literally called Stop Listening to the Consumer. And so basically, it's just like, they were both really good. Like, your presentation and the book were pretty much like complete opposites. But like, I saw points in both that made a lot of sense. And I guess my question is like, how do you deal with like so many ideas of like the right way to market? And like, how do you like navigate that and like find, I guess, what works best?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think I would say, so firstly, that there is a category component. I think for things like tech in particular, for example, obviously, if you have a real kind of product advantage or real technological advantage, it's a bit different. That then you're trying to kind of put it out there and often kind of find a market for it. And I think it is fair to say what I'm talking about here tend to be more those kind of consumer facing brands where, let's be really honest, most of them are at product parity. They just are, even with things like, I don't know, Netflix versus Paramount or versus Disney Plus or whatever. Ultimately, it comes down to personal preference, but they're ultimately a parity. So I think it is important to be honest with yourself about the category that you work in and also the product that you make. There are some products that really do have, you're absolutely right, a firm product advantage, and that's great. I suppose my question would be, how do you get a real product advantage? It is by kind of understanding who your consumer is. Where I would say that point about kind of stop listening to the consumer does kick in is almost, I said it's about timing. So there's kind of validation versus inspiration. And I think the reason a lot of people are pushing back on listening to the consumer at the moment is that for the last decade, way too much consumer input has been done in the kind of validation sense. You do a load of work and you come up with a great idea, and then you put it in front of 8 people in a focus group and go, I don't like it. And you think, oh, well, hang on. And of course, that's not representative of the real world. So I think, getting, and we do actually quite regularly say to our clients, like, you don't need to research this. You're only researching it, to be honest, to cover your ass, because you don't want to get fired if it goes wrong. You want to be able to say, look, you can point to some data and show that you've done it. So I think using the consumer, to cover your behind, or to check your homework after you've done it is pointless. And there, just have the courage of your conviction and get a great idea out the door. But I think where I still maintain, I even, to be honest, I think even the companies that aren't, as are tech based and aren't listening to the consumer, it's a little bit like kind of Jobs and Apple. The truth is that's because he was someone with a very, very good natural instinct for what people wanted. And if you've got that, great. But even then, most people don't, like, most people are not Steve Jobs. And it's like, that's the reality. Most people are not Steve Jobs. They don't have that natural instinct. And even if you do, the best way to hone that instinct, the best way to improve it, is to just go and talk to people and spend time with them. And it doesn't have to be research. It doesn't have to be data, but go and hang out where they hang out. Go and watch. I mean, I think my local supermarket think I'm mad because I spend quite a lot of time just standing around the supermarket aisles watching people buy stuff. But I find it really interesting because I like, oh, they've put that back and they've picked up that. I wonder what, do that. It doesn't have to be data. It doesn't have to be numbers, but immerse yourself in that perspective. And I don't believe that that's not valuable for any company.
Oh, I agree. I think that book, Alice, he was basically saying, when you just when you benchmark, for example, against all your competitors, you end up looking like all your competitors, and so then you don't stand out. But the brands that you showed there, Chevis, I mean, that is iconic, and when these are unique, people see these. They're, again, these kind of drink. They have unique profiles, unique tastes. They appeal to. I thought the way you segmented out around the business bottle, the special celebration bottle, all those things. Those are unique to these products, which stand out in a sea of sameness. A lot of whiskeys don't have that. So I think you guys, these products that you shared with us, have built this strong. They're brands in the minds of whiskey drinkers, over time. And so, just depending, I think that he was kind of saying in that book was, you don't want to go too far with customer insights, but I absolutely believe you need those as you're building, your products and your services. Anyway, who's got another question? Put it in the chat box or take yourself off mute, because we're going to wind this thing down. Let's make this the last question because it's almost an hour, and that's more than enough time for our special guest who's doing this out of the kindness of her heart. Who's got a question? Anybody? If not, I'll throw one out there. All right, so these folks are a lot of juniors and seniors going to be starting their marketing career. Any advice you'd share, Alice, on, I think of the AI and, and how that's impacting the world. Any advice you have for folks that are starting out as marketers, proper marketers today?
Okay, so number one is link in me. I don't have any jobs going now, but I might in the future. We were talking about this at the beginning. I'm afraid with the rise of kind of AI and everything is done kind of your CVs get filtered out painfully by AI, and I think a lot of getting in is going to be about knowing people and making connections. So on these sessions, it's brilliant that these sessions are happening. Connect with every person that does them. As I say, if I don't have a job now, I might in 5 years' time. So absolutely make sure you make those connections. anything you can do to stand out, I think it is still the case. Sorry, it's slightly blue story, but never mind. I had no connections into the industry whatsoever. And my dad was at a local fete and he saw someone walk past in a t-shirt that said live TV. And he went up to him and he said, my daughter's 16, she's desperate to get into media. Can you give us some work experience? And the guy stared at him like he was mad and said, what, at live TV? And he said, yeah. All right. My dad did not know that live TV was, I'm sorry, but a softcore porn channel. But I got work experience there, and I can guarantee you, deeply embarrassing, but I can guarantee you that got me my first interview in an ad agency, because people looked at it and went, she what? This is not me telling you to go and work in softcore porn, just to be really, really clear. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is standard CVs that look like everybody else's, there's so many of them.
Zoe Skaman started out with X-rated websites, SEO for an X-rated website. So you and Zoe have a similar background.
I really want to stress that's not the only way for women to get into this industry.
Yeah. These are just like random. This is not advice. We're not recommending this is the way to go. But I see.
I suspect the common thread there is something unusual.
Yeah, and obviously it was unusual, and people wanted to learn more.
Yeah, so that's what I would say. Is just look beyond. Knowing the marketing, knowing the robust side of things is really great and really important. But also look beyond for those kind of, that out of category experience that's just going to make you look a bit different. That is honestly my best advice for getting your CV noticed initially.
And don't forget, everybody, to connect with Alice on LinkedIn.
I'm very friendly, I promise.
And so I want to say that was fantastic. You shared this in theory, as I share with the students, customer centricity, but in reality, not so much in businesses today. Corporations, are failing in a lot of regards, and you'll show up thinking that they're going to be, they understand customers, they know their market, not true. And so spherical businesses work best. And Alice shared why and how that works. I call it inside out. No, you don't want to live from what's going on in here out. You want to be aware of outside the marketplace, customers inside your business. And so I asked her to speak about real world branding, and she brought it today, showing segmentations into engagement. That those maps were so cool. And so we want to have emotional, imaginative engagement, data-backed, it's consumer-backed and insight-backed. And so take all this advice you got today and use it, because it was fantastic. So with that, one more thing before we rock out of here, everybody. This is a tradition I run on my LinkedIn here. So I'm going to say on three, everybody put their thumbs up. I want to see thumbs up. Put a thumbs up on three, because we're going to put this out there again, and say thank you as you click off. That was fantastic. All right, everybody, have a great day, and thumbs up for Alice. All right, thanks. See you guys and gals on Tuesday. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Alice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was fantastic. I appreciate that. It was exactly what we needed to hear. And I just loved it. So, man.
I hope I misread the time, so I rattled through and then went,
no. I thought it was perfect. It was perfect. And again, thank you so much. And you'll see the thumbs up picture going up on LinkedIn with my forever being in debt to you for your kindness to these students with your time.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.